medical expert, but where I come from is software development and software engineering, kind of similar to Ross previously as well. We started Fuzzy Labs as a company that specializes in delivering artificial intelligence driven solutions for, and we've worked with a number of different industries. But I'd like to talk today about some very interesting work we did for a healthcare company and some of the things we're doing around that to develop tooling and libraries and so forth that I think feed into what is a very exciting and emerging area of application for artificial intelligence. And it's something that was talked about in the previous talk, which is using artificial intelligence to improve the treatment of certain conditions, to improve the efficiency of clinical specialists doing their work, and also in bringing control to individuals so that they have access to information and metrics about their own health that they can then action and work to improve. So there's two halves to this talk. The first is going to be on a couple of different areas of application. The second will be on a particular case study that we worked on, as I say, earlier this year with a medical devices company. And so the first application area that I want to discuss it involves drug discovery. So there's a great deal of drugs which have been discovered largely by accident, but nevertheless turned out to be hugely revolutionary in the medical field. If you take, for example, something like penicillin, which we all take for granted, but without which even simple infections could be very dangerous, that was discovered because it's produced by certain kinds of fungus. And so some of the ways that AI is being used to speed up this process of discovery, the first is using data mining to find novel molecules that can be potential drug candidates. So we can search over a very wide space of possible molecules and try to predict how they'll behave in a real situation. So how will they interact with various parts of our biochemistry, and how could they potentially be used to treat a particular illness, or indeed maybe for vaccine candidates as well. So one project to look into is DeepMind. So this is Google's artificial intelligence lab, and they have a project called AlphaFold, which uses a neural network to predict the properties of novel proteins. So protein folding has been a topic of interest in scientific computing for some time. It's the idea of saying, well, we know that there's a huge number of possible proteins that we could construct out of various amino acids. And we know that it's very difficult to predict how a particular protein will affect a person's body. And so protein folding is about simulating how a protein, what structure a protein will have in reality based on its basic sequence. DeepMind's AlphaFold is trying to use a neural network to make the predictions rather than doing the full simulation, so it can make inferences based on past data. Another interesting example that attacks this problem in a different direction is something from a company called BioRelate, who are up in Manchester. They are using text mining to allow clinical researchers to search huge volumes of pharmaceutical research papers so that they can find out if other people have been looking at doing similar experiments to themselves, if they've found similar results or indeed different results from the same experiments, and whether they're looking at similar candidates as well. Then a second area of application has to do with trying to collect huge amounts of data and make predictions and find correlations. This is particularly useful when it comes to looking at chronic illnesses, where often it's the case where you really have to look at how somebody's behavior changes on a day-to-day basis and try to figure out how that might be related to deterioration in their condition. So if it's something like diabetes or epilepsy, and I know somebody who's doing some work, particularly on epilepsy, collecting data from heart rate monitors and trying to figure out if he can predict epileptic fits in advance of them happening. So the idea here is to capture as much data as possible using quite often off-the-shelf sensors that can be that a person can wear and have on them all day, and then using that to try to make relationships to how they felt on a day-by-day basis or a week-by-week basis. And then slightly related to that, and something that we've become very interested in recently, has to do with deploying artificial intelligence models into low-powered hardware, so-called edge-based AI, or edge-based inference in particular, that we're interested in. So the idea here is that you take sensors, but what you want to do is, maybe you want to predict that somebody is sleeping on their back and perhaps they have a condition where sleeping on their back isn't ideal, and you want to tell them overnight how many times did they sleep on their back. Or something that we've done as a kind of side project for ourselves in order to learn more about this technology is we're building our own wearable fitness tracker. So this image on the left here is our rather crude hardware prototype that looks a little bit suspicious. I wouldn't wear that to an airport, that's for sure. But the idea here is that it has an accelerometer and it has a small microprocessor. It's got an Arduino, and we can use it to calculate steps, cadence, running power. But additionally, we're looking at using it to predict what your running style is, because there's several different styles of running, and serious runners want to train in a particular style, perhaps. So we're looking at deploying small neural networks, which we train in the cloud, but then deploy them to an Arduino device that can be mounted on the foot, so that we can make these predictions in real time. There's this emerging field called TinyML, and there's a book by a researcher who works actually at Google on TensorFlow, on deploying TensorFlow to mobile. So he's put out a book called TinyML, and it's all about how to deploy these machine learning models to an Arduino device using TensorFlow. So there's a new and very exciting emerging field here that has a huge range of applications to healthcare and medicine. And then the final area of application, and I know this has just been a bit of a whirlwind tour of things, but the area I think that has the most clear impact and is probably the easiest to demonstrate the value directly to people is in medical imaging. So medical imaging has to do with any kind of images that are taken for diagnostic purposes. That includes X-rays, MRIs, also CAT scans, PET scans, and so forth. It could also include plain photographs, and we'll look at that in a moment. The idea of the big value in applying AI here is not to do things that clinicians can't already do. A clinical expert can look at an X-ray or an MRI and make an assessment based on their knowledge and expertise, but it's allowing that to be scaled to a level where it's maybe not feasible for a human to do. So imagine if we could screen every single MRI for a range of signs of cancers and flag certain ones for clinical analysis. So it could be then that the clinician will take a closer look at certain features that they might otherwise not have taken a close look at. The picture I've chosen here is somewhat relevant to the current situation around the globe, which is, I think it's from Google's AI lab again. So this is training a neural network model to distinguish between two types of pneumonia, two causes of pneumonia, the one being bacterial and the other being viral. So something like the coronavirus would be a viral pneumonia case. So then I think there's been a great deal of interest in using AI to attack medical imaging recently, and it's coming to a point where the tooling, certainly in terms of software tooling and open source tooling, has become ubiquitous enough that people who maybe don't have a programming background, maybe clinical experts who can do a little bit of programming, are able to start taking some of this stuff off the shelf, putting it together and doing their own experiments. And so I think AI is, rather than programmers and software developers using AI to solve medical problems when they are usually not medical experts, it's becoming more the case that the clinical experts are able to make use of this technology themselves, maybe with a little bit of help from some programmers, in order to develop their own improved techniques, improved technologies, and improved tools. And some examples of those kinds of resources, I just wanted to list a few of them, but there's a great deal out there. So one is this monai.io, which is absolutely worth a look if you're interested in this sort of thing. So this is a complete open source medical imaging framework written in Python and based on standard Python data science tooling. Another is Clara, which is from NVIDIA, and Ross, of course, mentioned this earlier, and there were also a couple of images of this and references to this in the video, which we saw at the very beginning of the talk. So Clara is NVIDIA's healthcare and life sciences framework, which contains a great deal of tooling, including pre-trained models for the cloud. We could also deploy it to the edge, and indeed we could deploy it to the kinds of edge-based hardware that we saw earlier. And then there's another library which came out very recently. FastAI is a machine learning framework built on top of PyTorch. I'm going to talk a little bit more about FastAI in a moment when we get to the case study, but there was a recent release of FastAI which came with its own medical imaging library. A lot of these tools, including FastAI, come with support for industry standard medical imaging file formats. So we have, for example, DICOM, which is used across the medical industry. So being able to deal with those images and process those is hugely valuable. And so that's enough for the applications. And I realize, of course, there's a great deal of detail there, and that could be a talk in itself. And certainly, I'll look for. I'm definitely open to answering questions on particulars there, although I might want to defer to specialist sources in some cases. So we got to working with wound dressings and other medical devices. And this was earlier on this year. Interestingly, as a side note, our own hardware-based sensor AI project actually is what originally got us into a conversation with this company. And being a new company ourselves, getting into this kind of space is a rare thing, certainly with a large supplier. But I think these large companies are interested in seeing novel uses of both sensors and artificial intelligence, and so fortuitously, we were able to catch some interest there, and that led to a very exciting project for both us and for the client. So we had to deal with a lot of gory images of ulcers which are taken from diabetic patients. These ulcers are something which can take a very long time to heal and may not heal if not treated properly because of the nature of diabetes and its effects on wound healing. Now, I didn't want to show you any gory images, and I'm sure you're grateful for that. So I put this teddy bear in instead, and you just have to pretend this is an ulcer. I'm not going to show you any gory images, I promise that. So what we wanted to do was take a photo of one of these ulcers and identify the different types of tissue which you can find in that ulcer. So examples could be necrotic tissue, where the tissue is dying and needs to be removed before treatment can be applied. We may have something called granulation. Granulation implies that the wound is healing. Granulation is a good thing. We also have something called slough, which is this horrific slimy substance that you find on the wound that needs to be cleaned off. We're also interested in things like bacterial films and such things like that, which again, we need to clean. Now, of course, you would say, well, the clinician can look at the wound and identify those things. These are basic things. And sure, that's true. I think what the automation gives us as an extra is the ability to take images over multiple sessions and automatically record changes in the size of different regions and in the condition of the wound overall. This just helps the clinician to be able to, it gives them some context while they're doing assessment after assessment. And so the technique, the artificial intelligence technique that we're going to use to solve this problem is something called image segmentation. Earlier on, Ross mentioned how we would train a basic image classifier. So imagine we want to distinguish cats from dogs. So we would collect a bunch of images of both. We would label them. So we would say which is a cat and which is a dog. That's the human expert providing the training data. Then we allow a training algorithm to optimize the weights of a neural network so that the network can make its own predictions based on data it hasn't seen. Segmentation is a very similar task. And in a way, you can think of it as doing the same classification on every single pixel of an image. But maybe a more intuitive way to think about it is that we want to identify contiguous regions of an image that have some meaning to us. So the classic example is for a self-driving car. If we want to build a self-driving car, we need that car to be able to tell the difference between the road, the sky, some buildings, other cars, the boundaries of the road as well, so that it doesn't veer off, and the dividing lines of that road. So we would take a great deal of images recorded by a set of cameras in a car, and we would have to manually label that data. And what that comes down to is drawing boundaries on top of the regions of interest in different colors. And then when we train the algorithm, we know which color corresponds to which label that we're interested in. So maybe we probably use blue for the sky, and maybe we use gray for the road, and so forth. We had to do the same thing on these images of wounds. And so I'll step to here now. So overall, what we wanted to build as a solution was, of course, not just a model, because a model isn't useful on its own to the business, but we also wanted to build a web service where we can deploy the model, an API so that we can get inferences from this model, i.e. we can give it an image and it can tell us some assessment of that image. And we wanted to build a front-end web app and a mobile app that the clinicians can use. We wanted it so that a clinician can take an image of a wound, see the assessment according to the model, and then tell us if it's a good assessment or not. If it's a bad assessment, if our model has given a bad result, the clinician should be able to, or rather we should be able to add that image back into our training data, but get a human expert to have a look at it first and provide the correct labeling so that we can do another iteration of training and get a model which hopefully does a better job on that new image. Similarly, if we have a good image, we want to put that into the training data too, because we want to reinforce that this model gave us a good result in that case. So in this way, we were able to build a fully productionized end-to-end AI-based machine learning solution for the client. Now, the predictive model, it certainly wasn't perfect and it wasn't trained on a huge amount of data, and we'll come to that in a second. Nevertheless, it was able to at least demonstrate the value, and then for a large company that is perhaps risk averse when it comes to allocating budget, by being able to demonstrate the concept quickly on a small training set, we can then justify a larger investment to improve that model later. The first step in building this productionized AI system is gathering training data. So this is not so much a technical problem as a human problem, because we have to figure out, well, what constitutes good data here? how much of it do we need? Who's going to provide it for us? Ultimately, we're not clinical experts, so we also needed somebody from the business to guide us and train us first so that we could provide the labeling and so that we could help them provide the labeling so that they weren't entirely on their own doing that. Then you have to actually label the data. This is a labor-intensive process. It's ultimately a human being has to sit there and draw the boundaries over the labels, over the regions that we're interested in. We used a software as a service tool called Labelbox to help with this. It is a fantastic tool because it provides everything you would need to do your training workflow and your labeling workflow in advance. It also has an API so that we can drive it through that API. So remember when I said that our app will allow the user to rate an image, rate a classification, we can then feed that back into Labelbox using the API to say, this image needs a human to look at it to provide correct labels. This is just a screenshot of Labelbox. I'm a little bit short on time, so I will just jump over that one and talk about what I like to call a minimum viable model. So the idea here is, as I say, it's take a small training set. We did 500 images, and we chose a small set of clinical features that we were interested in. We also provided some guidance for the client as to what kind of images we're interested in here. So we said, well, they have to be in clear lighting. We have to make sure that it's a top-down image. It has to be in focus. We have to make sure that there aren't artifacts in the image that might confuse the training algorithm. One interesting artifact is that a lot of these images have a ruler in the image because they're using that as a scale so that they can look at the photo and estimate the size. The trouble is that the ruler could actually confuse our neural network, and it might start to use that as a basis to train when actually that's got nothing to do with it. The Fast AI framework allows you to get up and running very quickly when training a machine learning model. It is a layer of abstraction on top of PyTorch. And so in some ways it lacks certain flexibilities, but it also has a great deal of sensible defaults so that in most cases, if you're trying to train a model, and particularly when you're trying to do this minimum viable model, what you really want to do is train something to give you an idea of what can and can't be done so that you can decide what the next step is. And, in that way, we can do this in a truly iterative, agile manner, just like we would with any ordinary software development project. Fast AI emphasizes transfer learning. Transfer learning is this idea that you start with a pre-trained model. So we have something that's generally able to recognize features of images. Something like, there are various models like the various ResNets as an example, which is what we use. Then once we train the model, which we do in a Jupyter notebook, we finally deploy that model to Google Cloud Platform behind a web service. Now, somebody's probably going to ask a very good question, which is, why don't we use the Google AI platform? And we did try to use the Google AI platform. Unfortunately, it doesn't support Fast AI. So that's the very short answer to that, but I'm happy to elaborate on that a little bit later on in the Q&A if anyone is interested. But the Google AI platform is a very interesting cloud-based AI platform because it allows you to host a model, particularly PyTorch or a TensorFlow model, as a service, just like in a very similar way to how you would deploy a cloud function or a Lambda. So it's a serverless model hosting platform. Iterative training, I've mentioned this already, so I'll just jump over that and I'll leave you with this final slide. Here's all about us if you want to find out more about what we do and the kinds of projects we're working on. And that I am just over time, so I will hand over.